So we can't be pausing whiskey.
Our hero has arrived. You made a good choice coming back here. Wealthiest and most beautiful people on God's earth. They outsmarted everybody.
Killers of the Flower Moon. In 1923, the richest people in America started dying mysterious deaths. Shot, poisoned, blown up in their own homes. The FBI discovered these weren't random murders, but a calculated conspiracy to steal millions from an entire community. The Osage Nation struck oil and became millionaires overnight. But their white neighbors saw dollar signs and started planning murders. A respected rancher named William Hale orchestrated a killing spree that would inspire Martin Scorsese's latest blockbuster. His method was simple: marry into wealthy Osage families, then eliminate them one by one until the money flowed to his associates. Picture this. You're forced onto worthless land in Oklahoma. Then boom, oil erupts beneath your feet, and suddenly you're richer than Rockefeller. That's what happened to the Osage Nation in 1906. But their fortune came with a deadly price that would shock the world. By 1923, individual Osage people were pulling in $400,000 yearly in today's money. We're talking about Native Americans driving Rolls-Royces, wearing custom suits, living in mansions that put white millionaires to shame. Their children attended the finest schools in the country. They traveled to Europe for vacation, and they had servants and chauffeurs. The contrast was jarring. In a segregated America where Native Americans faced brutal discrimination, the Osage had become some of the wealthiest people on the continent. But this extreme wealth made them walking targets in a racist society that couldn't accept native prosperity. The federal government claimed they were protecting the Osage by forcing them to have white guardians manage their money. These guardians controlled every aspect of their lives. And when an Osage person died, guess who inherited the oil fortune? Bodies started dropping in 1918, and the pattern was terrifying. Shot in the head, but ruled suicide. Families blown up in mysterious explosions. Sudden illnesses affecting only the richest tribal members. What made it worse was the timing. Victims would die right after changing their wills or just before important business meetings. Some were found dead days before they were supposed to testify about suspicious activities. Local cops would show up, take a quick look, and close cases within hours without proper investigation. The message was clear: stay quiet or you're next. Behind these murders was William King Hale, the self-proclaimed king of the Osage Hills. This guy was the perfect criminal mastermind. Respected rancher, successful businessman, model citizen, praised in newspapers. He threw barbecues for the community, donated to churches, helped settle disputes between neighbors, and was considered a pillar of society. Nobody suspected this seemingly generous and upstanding man was orchestrating the most calculated killing spree in American history. Hale understood that the best disguise for evil was respectability. Hale's scheme was diabolically brilliant. He would identify wealthy Osage targets, then send in his associates to befriend them. Sometimes they'd even marry into Osage families to get closer to the wealth and gain legal inheritance rights. His most elaborate plot involved his own nephew Ernest Burkhart. Hale convinced Ernest to court and marry Molly Kyle, a beautiful Osage woman whose family controlled massive oilhead rights worth millions. Once Ernest married into the Kyle family, Hale began systematically eliminating Molly's relatives one by one. First target was Molly's sister Anna, found in a ravine with a bullet in the back of her skull. The sheriff ruled it suicide. Yeah, right, she shot herself in the back of the head. Then Molly's mother. Lizzie started getting mysteriously ill after visiting a doctor who was secretly on Hale's payroll, slowly poisoning her with insulin injections. But Hale's most audacious crime was murdering Molly's sister Rita and her husband Bill Smith. Hale hired explosives experts to plant bombs under their house while they were sleeping. The explosion was so massive, it shattered windows for miles around and left a crater where their home once stood, killing Rita, Bill, and their housekeeper instantly. Each death meant more oil wealth flowing to Ernest Burkhart and ultimately to William Hale. But Molly Kyle was getting suspicious and scared, watching her entire family die under mysterious circumstances. The Osage Tribal Council was desperate. Local law enforcement was either bought off, intimidated, or actively participating in the conspiracy. Private investigators they hired faced constant threats, and some ended up dead themselves. Finally, the Tribal Council bypassed local authorities and made a direct appeal to Washington, D.C. J. Edgar Hoover had just taken over the Bureau of Investigation and desperately needed a high-profile case to prove his new agency's worth. Hoover assigned the case to Tom White, a former Texas Ranger. White quickly realized this wasn't just a few random murders. It was a sophisticated criminal conspiracy involving much of the local power structure. He went deep undercover, posing as a traveling cattle buyer and insurance salesman. What he discovered was horrifying. The conspiracy involved doctors poisoning patients, lawyers forging documents, insurance agents writing fraudulent policies, law enforcement destroying evidence. Dozens of people were actively participating in this murder network. The breakthrough came when White managed to flip Ernest Burkhart against his uncle. Burkhart was living with crushing guilt and terror that Hale would eventually eliminate him as a witness. White offered him a deal: full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence and protection. Burkhart's confession was devastating, revealing in graphic detail how the murders were planned and executed, how authorities were bribed into silence, and how this conspiracy had operated for years with complete impunity. But even with overwhelming evidence, getting justice proved nearly impossible. Hale had deep connections throughout Oklahoma's legal system, plus money to hire the best lawyers. His first trial ended in a hung jury. Even with overwhelming evidence, they couldn't get a conviction. It took a second trial in a different jurisdiction to finally convict Hale of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. But here's the part that'll make your blood boil. He served only 18 years before being paroled in 1947. 18 years for orchestrating multiple murders and stealing millions. He walked free and died peacefully in 1962. The FBI claimed they had solved the case, but that's where the real cover-up began. They focused on the most obvious cases while ignoring dozens of other suspicious deaths. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 60 people, but many believe over 100 were actually murdered during this period. This horrific story stayed buried for decades until journalist David Grann published Killers of the Flower Moon in 2017. Martin Scorsese's 2023 film adaptation starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro finally brought this story to mainstream audiences worldwide, grossing over $150 million. But the film sparked controversy within the Osage community. Many felt it focused too heavily on white perpetrators instead of properly centering the indigenous victims. Others appreciated that their story was finally being told to a massive audience, even if the perspective wasn't perfect. The film's release triggered renewed calls for federal investigation into unsolved cases from this period. The Osage Nation has formally requested that the FBI reopen these cold cases and conduct modern DNA testing on remains that were never properly examined. This story connects directly to modern crises facing Native communities. The current epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women mirrors what happened to the Osage in the 1920s. Law enforcement agencies still show reluctance to properly investigate crimes against Native Americans. What makes this case particularly chilling is how normal the killers appeared. Hale wasn't some obviously dangerous criminal. He was a respected community pillar. His ability to maintain this facade while orchestrating dozens of murders shows how evil can hide behind respectability. The incomplete justice adds another layer of horror. Most perpetrators escaped punishment entirely, and even those caught served minimal sentences. The system that was supposed to protect the Osage instead facilitated their systematic murder, and when truth came out, ensured minimal consequences for killers. Even after FBI investigations and Hollywood movies, most killers walked free and dozens of murders remain unsolved. William Hale served just 18 years, while victims' families never got real justice. What shocks you more? That this systematic genocide happened, or that most of America never heard this story until a Hollywood movie? Drop a comment if this shocked you as much as it did me.